we were causing crises for these businesses, some of which went out of business. Somebody went to prison.
I think the tweet said, we've all been fired and I've got the keys to the Twitter and nobody knows it's me. I love that.
I suppose it was such a kind of high profile occasion, wasn't it? Everyone was speculating about it, and I suppose it's probably a confidentiality issue, isn't it? They didn't want their kind of trade secrets, if you like, revealed to the world.
Welcome to Embracing Marketing Mistakes, the only podcast for senior marketing professionals that celebrates the biggest marketing mistakes and fails, helping you learn practical lessons from other people's misfortune. Also, you could double your return on investment and achieve record revenue for your brand. Have you ever experienced a real brand crisis? Do you worry about being properly prepared should the worst occur? Are your social team ready for something to go viral, all for the wrong reasons? Well, in this week's episode, Will and I are joined by Ann Wright, who is the founder of Roughhouse Media. Ann specialises in equipping brands with confidence in a crisis. She provides crisis communication support and strategy, as well as delivering courses in media training and video production. Ann spent a decade working as a newspaper reporter before joining the BBC. She produced high-profile programmes ranging from news, current affairs, documentaries and consumer investigations to huge live events. These included royal weddings, children in need, the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, Remembrance Sunday, and many, many more. I know you're going to enjoy this episode because Ann shares some brilliant crisis management tips, and even better, she talks about two interesting anecdotes, or fails, however you want to call them, during her career in crisis management. So as always, sit back, relax, and let's hear how you can improve your crisis management strategy without having to spend hours learning how to do it. This week with Will and I online, we've got Ann Wright from Roughhouse Media. Ann, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here.
Good, thank you. Now, Ann, you are a bit of an expert in crisis management and media training. We've covered media training before on this podcast, quite a bit in terms of questions and strategies. If you've heard that episode before, fine. If you've not, look up. We did an interview with Guy Clapperton. It was about 3 or 4 months ago, wasn't it? Well, quite a few episodes ago. However, we didn't really touch on crisis management and how to avoid or how to manage yourself through a crisis. And I think our listeners will be interested in that. So why don't you give us a bit of a background of what your experience is in that area particularly?
So my kind of initial experience was I was a journalist for a long time, working first as a print journalist, and then I worked for the BBC for 15 years. And as part of my time at the BBC, I worked in the consumer unit, which meant that I was basically hunting down rogues and businesses which weren't doing the right thing. Did lots of undercover filming to expose people who weren't doing the right thing, and learnt quite a lot of lessons about crisis management because we were causing crises for these businesses, some of which went out of business. Somebody went to prison who I was investigating. So that side of things, it has informed a lot of what I now advise people how to do. But then as part of media training, when I started working with Roughhouse full time and running Roughhouse, and we developed crisis training and crisis management, you build on your knowledge essentially. And, I write crisis strategies for clients, run crisis training courses, we run crisis simulations, and all of those, give me a body of knowledge with which I can help my clients.
In your experience, Ann, how do you go about writing a crisis strategy that works?
So I'm literally writing one at the moment. I've spent this week writing one for a museum, and they had a basis. And the process that I went through with that was I looked through what they had drafted, realised there were quite a lot of gaps. For example, they hadn't included anything about social media, which nowadays is a huge issue. So I'm now I have a kind of my own template that I cross-reference. So I'm now merging my template with their template. Essentially, what you need to do is you need to know who your team is, and so, set down who is going to do what in your crisis team. So people know in advance what their role is going to be in a crisis. You need to have assessed what might go wrong, categorise that, if there are several ways of categorising it, but looked at internal issues. That might be a safeguarding issue, might be an IT issue, might be customer service problem. Look at external things, which might be a pandemic. It might be that there's a riot outside. Who knows? It could be anything. And then worked out a strategy for dealing with that. So if that happens, what are you going to say about it? What are you going to do? And obviously there's business continuity issues, but obviously what I concentrate is on the communications. How do you communicate in a way that is going to protect your reputation? Because if you say nothing, fundamentally, if you say nothing, people will either think you're going to hiding something or you've done something wrong.
Yeah, you create a vacuum, don't you, if you don't say something?
Yeah.
So let's
multiple examples.
Yeah, so let's break down some of those components in a bit more detail then. So you mentioned the team first of all. So who are the kind of key components in that team? I mean, presumably it goes beyond just the marketing team, doesn't it? Who else would you typically involve in a robust crisis plan?
So you want the team that's managing the crisis, which will be your central kind of senior leadership team effectively. But then you also want to have a crisis communications team. So the senior leadership it'll vary depending on what the issue is. So if it's a safeguarding issue, it would have HR. If it's an IT issue, you probably wouldn't want HR, but you would want IT, for example. But you're always going to have the CEO, the head of communications, the chief operating officer, finance, legal counsel, those kind of people as part of your crisis management team. And then in your crisis comms team, you probably want to include social media, the PR, media relations people, and the marketing people, digital marketing, because all of those people are going to have roles. So you might need to be quite broad. Some organisations have one person doing all the PR, and that's really difficult for them fundamentally. But it's more about thinking what roles are people going to fulfil. So you need to have someone who is going to liaise with the crisis management team, which will probably be the head of comms. You need somebody who is going to do the writing. You need somebody who's going to answer the phones and manage media relations. You want somebody who's going to do social media. You want to have in place media monitoring, social media monitoring. So you need to know you've got all those components ready so that everybody knows, right, my role is going to be the writer. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is writing a holding statement, for example. Then I need to be writing a Q&A. I might be writing a briefing for a spokesperson. And so, once everybody knows their role in advance, that's the first thing in a plan, really, is the personnel.
And presumably one or several people will kind of lead the crisis response, and will they then involve people as and when required on a kind of triage basis? Is that how it would typically work?
Yes. I mean, and you would, obviously you're going to have, you might have, if it's say it's a hack, which is obviously, or some kind of data breach, which happens a lot. You've got the head of IT. They're going to be deploying their team to deal with things, but they will need to communicate with the rest of the senior management team what's happening and feedback. So you would have regular meetings of the senior management team to sort of update on progress, but they'll be deploying their team to do whatever is needed.
Yeah, it's interesting you mention a hack because working in public relations, Will and I have been involved in quite a lot of crises, some of which we can mention on here and a lot of which we can't. But talking about what we've not been mentioned in, but we've been affected by, is an actual hack. And that was, it's just happened earlier this year. Well, I think it was February this year it started, and it was the Onclusive. I don't know if you're aware of this, Anne, but there was a hack. Onclusive Media. They're owned by Kantar Precise. They're all one and the same company, aren't they? I think, allegedly, yeah. Brackets, close brackets. But basically, Onclusive is like a media monitoring company, and they got hacked. And what's happened is somebody hacked. It was like a ransomware issue, and it shut down all the computer systems and monitoring, actual media monitoring. It's a media monitoring company. Shut it down, and it meant that they then had to go into crisis recovery mode. And as a PR agency, the thing that one of the key things that a client wants from results is our coverage. And we had no media
Yeah.
coverage for over a month. Consequently, that caused us a lot of problems. It was interesting to watch how the CEO of that Inclusive dealt with it. We got emails about what they were doing every day, just like what you were talking about there with the IT hack. The management team, they had to rebuild their entire media monitoring platform from the inside back up again because they were being held to ransom. And it was just interesting how they were communicating it. In my opinion, I don't think they handled it brilliantly because they gave you a month. They gave us a month's fees back, but it wasn't handled brilliantly, and I think they've lost a lot of clients off the back of it because people are just they can't rely on it.
What do you think they didn't do well then? They've obviously given you money back, but what didn't they do well?
The whole handling of it was an email, and the email was from the CEO, which I thought was quite nice, but it was manifested. He'd obviously had it written. The email came from on your side at onclusive.com, which I felt was not very authentic at all. But also, the things that they said they were doing were international things, which had no bearing on me in the UK. I don't give a shit what you're doing in Europe and in the US. I care about what my UK clients and what's happening to our coverage. And we were dealt with last. And actually, I sent a reply to him and he never even replied to us because my team had been contacting their customer services, asking why we weren't getting coverage in this area. And they just had no response. They were overwhelmed. And we felt sorry for them. You know, we really did. But it got to 6 weeks in and they were still just sending one email out a week or whatever saying, we are looking into this situation. We're rebuilding our platform. We're recovering well. And we're like, well, we've not got any coverage. Nobody's replied to it. So it was just a badly handled. But that was from being the other side of the crisis. I thought it was quite fascinating. And I think they probably could have learned a few things from you on how to deal with it. Because they put stories out in the media that made it look like they were handling it. But for a customer, it wasn't handled well at all, I didn't think.
Let you stop your rant. What they haven't thought about is who their stakeholders are. So you as their customers, their clients, you're a key stakeholder. So you're one of the most important people they need to communicate with. Yes, they need to communicate with the media, but actually you've got to think, how am I going to communicate with my stakeholders? And how often do I need to communicate? What do I need to say? And the message that you need is different to the message that the media's getting potentially, although anything that they say to you, they need to be aware can, be broadcast anywhere. Everything's a leaky vessel nowadays. But you've got to think, as well as who's going to be on my team, who are my stakeholders, and how am I going to communicate with them? What do they need to know? How often do they need to know? I was working with a law firm recently, and they'd had a platform. It wasn't theirs. Their third-party platform had a hack and affected something like 100 law firms. So law firms weren't able to complete their conveyancing. They weren't able to communicate with their clients. I mean, it was awful. Ouch. And apparently this third party's communications likewise was absolutely awful. They just weren't talking to their clients. And that's fundamental, because you've got to show that you're doing the right thing. I mean, fundamental to crisis communications is to do the right thing and to be seen to be doing the right thing. And if you don't do the right thing by your clients, by telling them what's going on and giving them confidence that you're sorting something out, then they're going to go somewhere else.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it can be pretty catastrophic, can't it, if a company gets this wrong? I think there's people, I mean, a company could go under potentially, couldn't it?
Yeah, God, totally, yeah. And there are examples of that. And it doesn't have to be, it's not all the big P&Os of the world and BPs of the world and BBC, for example. It's all of whom have had really high-profile crises. It can be really local. I mean, where I live in West London, and our local paper every year publishes a list of all the restaurants and cafes which have 0 or 1 stars hygiene ratings. Now, if you're a local pub and the local paper says your kitchens are dirty fundamentally, what's going to happen to your clientele? That's a really big crisis for a local business. So it doesn't have to be a really huge, all over the front page of the Daily Mail type of thing. It can be hyper local, but still hugely impactful.
I think though, like we're all talking about the media, but I think the thing the example that I was using with the Inclusive is because I was a stakeholder, like you say, a customer, and I just felt like what they were communicating in the media was completely different as to what we were being communicated as a customer. You read in the media, it was like we're dealing with a situation, we're resolving it, and I think that authenticity is what you've got to get right. It's difficult, and I know, and I felt sorry for them, like I said, but 6 weeks in, it was quite painful.
So on that, actually, that's quite an interesting point, Anne. You mentioned, crises aren't necessarily things that just happen to BP or Virgin Media or somebody like that. So would you say every company needs a crisis plan of some description, whether you're a cafe, a restaurant with one branch, or a restaurant with 150 branches?
I mean, it seems massively over the top to have a full crisis plan if you're a kind of a local tea shop or something. But I think you do need to think how if something happens, you need to think, how am I going to deal with it, and how am I going to communicate, and who do I need to communicate with, and what do I need to say? And it probably the higher the stakes are, the more planning needs to go into it. The more complex your organisation, the more you need a plan. But everybody should be aware of it. It's like an insurance policy.
Anne, how should companies balance being responsive and getting a statement out quickly versus taking the time to understand the situation fully? What are the risks of being rushed just to get a statement out? The vacuum, everyone's talking. What can we say?
But your initial statement doesn't have to say very much, really. Your initial statement has to say, we know this has happened. We're concerned about it. We're on it, essentially. It doesn't have to go into details, but if you don't say anything, then that just leaves a vacuum. There was an example that I always cite in my crisis training of another local example. There was a fire at a hotel here locally. I live in as I said, I'm about half an hour from Heathrow. And there was a fire. There were 17 fire engines, so it's a pretty big fire, 17 pumps, really big fire. And it happened about 5 o'clock one evening, and I was watching. So I was aware of this. I was watching social media. The company didn't put out a statement until 9 o'clock the next night, so more than 24 hours later. In the meantime, customers were going, just turned up at my hotel and it's on fire, on social media. I mean, it was extraordinary that they didn't say anything at all. All they needed to say initially was, we're really sorry, there's been a fire. At the moment, we're closed. This is what you need to do to customers. But if you don't say anything, it just makes you look like you don't care, makes you look like, you're hiding something. The statement, when they did put a statement out, the statement also libelled somebody, which wasn't very good.
Perfect.
Potentially libelled somebody.
So social media, I think it's fair to say has really kind of dramatically changed the way crises unfold, hasn't it? So how important now is kind of incorporating social media from your perspective in a crisis plan, and do you see a lot of companies failing to do that?
Well, the one I'm writing at the moment, they hadn't covered social media, and you need a social media policy. But social media is a tool, so you can use social media in a crisis for your own means. Because if you've got a statement that you're putting out, or you're communicating your Q&A or whatever it might be about what's happened, you're not reliant on the media publishing it anymore. You can publish it yourself, and you can get it out to a limitless audience. There was one example of years ago now, but the Associated Board for the Royal Schools of Music, who set music exams all over the country, there was snow, and for them that was a crisis because it meant that they had to cancel lots of exams. So instead of individually contacting music teachers and music exam locations, what they did was email all of them and say, we will be putting updates on which exams are going ahead and when, and which ones are cancelled on Twitter. And so all they had to do was put things on Twitter and everybody could access it. So it's a really useful tool, but you also need to be aware, as we all know, that trolling takes place, and people can put things on inadvertently. There was the example of HMV. Was it HMV when they were making their staff redundant and they were live tweeting the redundancy meeting? I mean,
I think
so you can't ignore it.
I think the tweet said, "We've all been fired, and I've got the keys to the Twitter, and nobody knows it's me." I love that. They were just sat there tweeting, were hidden somewhere, and people were frantic. Directors were allegedly,
locked in the social media office.
Yeah, like tweeting away as they'd all been made redundant. I mean,
So you need to have the logins on your crisis plan. Is one of the things that I always say you have to include, is know what the logins are. So not necessarily because of that, but if you've got the head of social media is off on a holiday in somewhere with no reception, and you need to get into social media, you need to be able to, that's
I mean, I think something we do at from our perspective at Prohibition when we're dealing with issues or crises is kind of use social media listening tools to kind of check the temperature of a particular issue, and that can be quite a useful way to understand how big an issue something is. You can watch it evolve, can't you, in real time, and then take action as and when required.
The other thing to be aware of is that journalists use social media as a source. So nowadays they don't have to ring everybody up to get quotes. They just go on social media and they've got instant quotes about every issue, and they'll be using social media to look for interviewees, to look for victims of an issue. So they will. It's not just the social media; it's the media use it as well.
Is there anything a brand can do to kind of mitigate against that? Because I think we've had clients where around key gifting occasions, for example, said delivery arrives late, it arrives broken, whatever it might be, and straight away the media are in touch with those disgruntled customers, and it becomes a news story. From your experience, is there anything brands can do to prevent that or minimise the potential for that to happen?
Well, don't get things wrong in the first instance is probably the first piece of advice, but that's not really realistic. I think actually sometimes just being honest, an honest apology. Yes, things have gone wrong, and not trying to, if you try and dissemble, people see through it. But if you admit things have gone wrong and apologise, and they try to do something to fix it, then that can go a long way. Just hold your hands up. People are really scared of being honest about mistakes, but actually, most of the time, if you do the right thing, people accept it. I mean, when I worked at BBC's consumer unit, I worked on a series called UK's Worst, and the BBC it's part of the Watchdog stable of programmes, and the BBC had a huge database of complainants, people who had contacted BBC because their hairdo had been bad or whatever it might be, or they'd had a rotten holiday or something. And almost always when we rang them up, they said, well, they didn't apologise and they didn't accept there was anything wrong. And if they hadn't, if they'd done the right thing in the first instance and said, right, you can have a free hairdo. I worked on a programme called UK's Worst Hair Disasters. So they said you can have a free hairdo, or you can, we'll give you a free weekend holiday or whatever it might be. They wouldn't have complained. They'd be quite happy. And then people go away as an advocate saying, oh, they were great. When I complained, they did X, Y, Z. And, I think just that it can go a long way to maintaining a good reputation.
And that was one of your fails as well, wasn't it? One of the mistakes you shared with the show, working on that show for the BBC.
So I worked on a programme called UK's Worst Hair Disasters. And the thing about working on a programme with the title UK's Worst is you have to be really, really legally sure that the thing is pretty bad. Basically, you can't say something's the UK's worst without being, legal to the hilt. So we had to go and experience everything. We had to have evidence for everything we said. So, for example, with UK's Worst Hair Disasters, there was a hairdresser's in Norfolk, which did braids, and there'd been multiple complaints about it. So I went undercover to have braids put in my hair, and
How was it?
I was there for 8 hours it was unbelievable. So my hair is brown. They put ginger braids in. They didn't have enough hair. They were scrabbling around on the floor for stray bits of hair to add on. They had to send out their work experience person to another hairdresser's to get more hair. They were smoking pot and drinking whiskey,
I hope they were
and they were
sharing.
sealing the ends. I don't know if you know when they were sealing the ends with a lighter. Literally, I mean, it was extraordinary. We filmed the whole thing because I was
Brilliant.
wearing a secret camera, and we had a bag with a secret camera. So that was, they went out of business afterwards, basically, and I think they kind of deserved it. But that was quite an experience. 8 hours sitting in a chair, pretending to.
Blimey.
Did your hair look terrible afterwards as well?
Braids.
After 8 hours, or was it all right? It was
My
just
hair
experience.
looked absolutely awful.
Right.
No, it looked terrible, and I had to go home. It was in Norfolk, and we had a hairdressing expert who was in Swindon, who was then meant to assess my hair. And so we didn't have time to do it all in one day because it had taken 8 hours. So I had to go home, put a towel on my head and sleep with it in, and then go to Swindon the next day to have my hair, have it all taken out. And I was already getting blisters around the back from where it had been attached.
Oh my God.
So yeah, it was.
I can't imagine that
Not
was cheap either to have that done, was it?
Oh, I don't remember. But I don't think it was that. This wasn't a classy joint. Come on, it was.
Or smoking
No.
smoking a spliff and drinking whiskey.
It wasn't Tony and Guy then.
No.
Well, that's a
No,
dedication
it
to the
wasn't
craft.
Tony and
I think. Yeah.
We've also got another. And we've also got another story, haven't we, regarding the Huffington Post? Do you want to explain what happened there, Anne?
When I was at the BBC, I worked in the consumer unit. Then I went and worked in BBC's live events department, which produces major state occasions, basically. And I did that for 5 years. And after I left the BBC, I continued to work for them on a freelance basis. And each time I did an event, I would just post some pictures on my blog, just do a nice little piece about having worked on Kate and William's wedding, for example. And when Meghan and Harry got married, the Huffington Post found my blog and rang me and said, can you be interviewed about being a producer about producing a big major state occasion? And I was ignored all the advice that I would ever give anybody in media training, was just really flat and just said, oh yeah, that's great. Didn't do the due diligence of thinking it through, didn't think about what the questions might be, didn't think about what my key messages should be, all the things that I would tell everybody you have to do before an interview. And what I did do was ring the editor of events on the day of the interview and say, just to let you know, I'm doing this interview with the Huffington Post about Harry and Meghan's wedding, and just I thought I'd let you know. I did the interview and I came off the phone, and my phone literally exploded with anger. It was the editor had rung me straight back, and she went bananas. Ooh. And I was a traitor to events. I was breaching my contract. I was, just awful. And basically, I've never worked with the BBC again, and I never will. That's why I can tell the story.
Surely it depends what you blinking said about if you were absolutely complimentary about the experience and the brilliant work that the BBC do behind the scenes of a royal wedding, they hadn't seen it by then, surely.
No, they hadn't seen it. I had to ring the Huffington Post up. She demanded that it never run, so I had to ring up the Huffington Post and beg them not to run it. And I don't think I'd said anything. I mean, I would never. I loved working in events, so I would never have been horrible about it. Never in a million years. But that didn't matter.
Quite a strange reaction, really. I think that's a bit of an overreaction, to be honest, for them to be so angry.
Well,
depends what you said, though, I suppose.
She doesn't know what I said. So,
no one ever.
No one does now.
Yeah, it's on.
Nobody does. And I said I never worked for them since. So that was the end of my freelance BBC career.
Well, it's their loss, isn't it?
I suppose it was such a kind of high-profile occasion, wasn't it? Everyone was speculating about it, and I suppose it's probably a confidentiality issue, isn't it? They didn't want their kind of trade secrets, if you like, revealed to the world?
Well, I think it's trade secrets probably about every event. You've got funerals and weddings and coronations and goodness knows what.
So if you're working in marketing now or in comms, what advice would you give to somebody to avoid a social media or a PR crisis in 2024? What are like the 3 things that they can do to avoid it?
To avoid a crisis or a
to prevent
social
a crisis, what are the 3 things?
Or just getting...
Well, just 3 things to prevent or avoid a potential crisis. What can you do to avoid it and prepare it? Because the worst thing is that they have to call you, me, all of us together, and we have to get in a room and work with the CEO and the C-suite and guide them through the crisis. What can they do to avoid that?
So, I don't think you can avoid a crisis because it can come at you from anything. You could have a bomb go off outside your building. That's a crisis. You can have a pandemic. That's a crisis. You can have a hack, as we said. That's not necessarily something that you can't prevent a crisis happening. And I did a crisis plan for a charity, and we were going through the risks and auditing the risks. And she said, we must have staff being arrested. I was like, what? She said, I've had 2 staff arrested in the last year. And, I don't think you can stop those things happening. But what you have to do is have the plan so that when they do happen, you can stop them becoming a crisis. So you might have a situation, and if you respond in the right way, it doesn't turn into a crisis. Or you might have something which is always going to be a crisis, but if you respond in the right way, it's not going to damage your reputation long term. But you have got, fundamentally, you will not have fewer crises if, as a company, you do the right thing. So you look at P&O, for example, and when they sacked all of their staff by Zoom, if they'd done the right thing as a company and gone through the proper employment procedures, they wouldn't have had the crisis that they went through. They chose to not do the right thing by their staff.
Yeah, that was shocking.
And totally self-inflicted. And you see that a lot, actually, don't you? These kind of self-inflicted crises that could easily, as you say, if the company had done the right thing, it could have been avoided. Something else to ask you, actually, which I'm quite interested in. So you mentioned the kind of the second stage or part of the process is kind of scenario testing, where you kind of, you've assembled your team, your crisis team, but then you start to think what kind of crises or issues could affect us as a business. Now, I get it. Yeah. You can have a customer complaint, staff getting arrested. You can have things like a hack. But how on earth do you plan for things like a pandemic? I mean, how creative should you be in your list when you're coming up with these things? Because, I wonder how many companies had planned for a global pandemic.
The government hadn't planned for a global pandemic.
No, exactly. So, how do we actually plan for these scenarios? Should we just think about anything that could possibly affect us?
I think you need to have a session where you pull in everybody, not everybody, but you pull in people from across the organisation. So there's somebody who works, I work with lots of charities, and, they're quite exposed because they've got, often they've got charity shops, they've got loads of volunteers, so they have particular risks. Get somebody who's a volunteer to sit round that table and talk about the things that might go wrong. Get the receptionist to talk about what might go wrong. Don't just have the people who are in ivory towers, because everybody will have a completely different perspective. But I think you're better to have a really big pool of everything. And then what you do is you think, right, which are the ones we're going to make a plan for specifically, the ones that are either highly likely to happen or going to be very damaging. So, for example, a hack could be very, very damaging, and it's highly likely, so you want to plan for a hack. A pandemic, well, before the pandemic, we never ever talked about pandemics as being a risk. Now, you probably would have it as a risk and you'd have a bit of a plan, but realistically, the likelihood of it happening again is probably low. So the ones which are most likely to be damaging and most likely to happen, you have a specific plan for. The rest you just have, generic. If we have a staffing issue, this is the kind of this is the kind of process we might go through if we have a customer complaint about X. This is the kind of thing that we might have.
You can plan for most things, but inevitably, I suppose...
You can't plan for everything.
No, and it always ends
impossible.
up being... And at the end of the show, there's a few examples I can think of over the years of crisis scenarios that nobody could have planned for.
Oh, no, I mean, while we were just talking there, I was just thinking about the Boeing situation with, you're only supposed to blow the bloody door. That's what's been happening to Boeing, hasn't it? Like with their airliners, the doors have been
That's pretty
blowing
much
off.
the worst thing that can happen on a plane, isn't it?
When you think about airline safety and security, and then one of the windows just pulls out. It's not just happened once, has it? It's happened on a few times, and it's all about how safe is that airline.
Yeah, I was going to say airlines are great fodder for crisis comms examples, actually. You've got United, who... Do you remember the guy being dragged out of the plane because they'd overbooked the seats? That was just...
And United Breaks Guitars was a good one that I used to use in my crisis training.
Yeah, I still use that.
It's a great,
I use that
great
in crisis
song.
Training.
It's
a great song.
I could sing it right now, but I'm not going to.
Something like...
We'll play a little clip now.
22 million views or something.
We'll play it in the pod. We'll put a clip from it in the pod so people can hear it. The song, because the song was brilliant.
It's had 22 million views, and their share price dropped. I can't remember how much, but huge amounts after that.
And they sold 2 albums off the back of it, I think. Fair enough.
Well, there you are.
Off one broken guitar.
So who's getting this right, Anne? So we've talked a lot about kind of what can go wrong and, a few companies that have got it wrong. Is there anybody out there that's really good at this, particularly with regards to kind of taking ownership, apologising properly, that side of things?
So less on that front, but thinking about the royal family at the moment with Prince Andrew, they probably got that wrong. With the King's illness, they have got that pretty textbook right because they've communicated clearly. He's been seen fairly regularly doing sort of small things, and people feel like they know what's happening. With the Princess of Wales, literally, I was literally about to write a blog on the vacuum, and then they published that photo of them, which was doctored. I mean, that was a massive PR fail, to be honest. But then when she came out and she made that statement, and it's a real example of how if you come out and you say something, it stops things dead. If you get your statement right, then that can absolutely stop speculation and stop. So I think having done badly, they've now pulled it back and they're doing it really well, really well.
I think Kate got the balance right as well, because she was talking directly to the people, and also she had she said you're not alone. Yeah. And she was talking as there was a lot of message of hope about, even though the conditions affected her. And she honestly, some of the coverage and some of the online vitriol that you see about it all, it was just completely out of control. So I was glad that she did something to stop it, like you say. It did stop it dead, but it was authentic again. Yeah. She communicated authentically, and that's what was brilliant about that, rather than a press release.
Yeah, I think they absolutely. Yeah, I think they just did a good job.
What business leaders are out there who are authentic? And, and obviously we've talked about the royals, but is there anybody in the world of business that can kind of has the common touch and can kind of connect with people in that
Elon
similar
Musk?
way? Mark Zuckerberg?
Yeah, Mark Zuckerberg, the multi-billionaire Mark Zuckerberg.
So this is going back a little while, but do you remember when Alton Towers had that crash, and there was a crash on the roller coaster, and somebody lost their legs, and the boss of Nick Varney, who, if you watch his interviews, he just did an absolutely sterling job, because they had made mistakes, and there was they hadn't done, they weren't squeaky clean. But because he came out right from the beginning and led from the front, and he showed empathy and concern and did all the right things and kind of kept the high moral ground when he was getting a really hard time in interviews. There was one interview with Kay Burley where she was absolutely awful. But because of the way he carried himself, their reputation wasn't damaged at all. Actually, they did really well.
Yeah.
So he's a good example. If you look back, there was also not that long ago. Do you remember OVO Energy? They sent out a press release or some kind of statement, tweet or something saying, if you get cold, cuddle your cat and wrap up warm. Do you remember that? I think it was last year when the energy crisis. And the chief exec literally went on to breakfast the next day and said, I'm really glad you're asking me about this because I want to hold up my hands and say, we did it wrong. It was really crass and we're really sorry and we've retracted it. And he just came out and he absolutely said and did the right things and just did it very fast.
Yeah, he did. I saw that interview. Yeah, he did it right. Yeah, because they did get it wrong.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous. Someone had done 10 top tips on how to stay warm this winter during the cost of living crisis, and it was clearly a PR person that had done it, and they'd not thought it through, and it just landed so badly at the time.
So can you teach that kind of response?
Yeah.
You know, this idea that you've got to kind of connect with people, you've got to take accountability, or does that just kind of come naturally to you as a to a business leader? Do you ever teach people how to kind of project themselves more authentically on camera?
You want to really you need to train people. You know, and we do crisis interview training. You need to teach them how to deal with what we call them ambush questions, but we need to teach them how to deal with things that are chucked at them from a great height or whatever, from left field. Some people are never going to be able to be natural, and you're in a high stress situation. But what you want to do is give them the tools and give them some practice in advance. You want to make sure they've had a chance to practice, make sure they know how to frame their answers, because that's actually quite important. You need to think about, there's endless acronyms out there about how to respond in a crisis. The one I like is CAP, which is Care, Action, Perspective. So it's show that you're bothered, show that you're doing something about it, and then if you can, put some perspective on it. So if it's hack, as one of many companies that have been hacked in the last year or something like that. So if you can frame your answers, that gives you confidence. When you go in, you know how to give an answer and get your key message across, and that helps. And you need to think about how, my absolutely bugbear, can't bear phrase is our thoughts are with the victims. It just sounds like somebody's just told me to say that I've got to sound bothered. You need to sound natural, and you need to therefore incorporate that into your answer. You need to incorporate your care into your answer somehow, so it sounds natural. And in a lot of cases, we do crisis training for a big chain of shops where there is a lot of scope for accidents because of the nature of this chain and what they sell. And we know that in real life, if something happened and somebody injured, they're lovely, they would absolutely be devastated. And so that would come across naturally. But that's about their personality actually more than
it's easier to
teach it.
It's easier to train good humans, is what you're saying there, Anne. If they're a good, authentic person and they can communicate that authenticity rather than hiding behind ministerial responses. Because you could watch an MP and how they answer questions and think, oh, they deal with the media quite well, but do they? Because the media interview, they go particularly hard at a minister, and if you're in a crisis, that's pretty much how the media could treat you if you're not dealing with it properly. I always think the best examples of people that deal with the media. Yeah, you've given some good examples there, like the CEO of Alton Towers, and there was one of another airline actually when the airline ran across the. It ran off the runway at the bottom of the runway at East Midlands Airport, and I can't remember. I think it was Midland was the airline years and years and years ago. And he only lived 5 miles away, and he came to the. We used this when I used to teach at Leeds University on the PR degree, and as an example, because he lived 5 miles away, he just drove to where the accident was. I don't think anybody was particularly hurt, but he was there, stood there, did all the interviews on site right, and it was all completely
On site,
authentic. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And that really, really can come
Yeah.
across. It's a nice thing. It gives that sort of sense of authenticity.
There's another clip that we used to use. There's another clip that we used to use of Richard Branson when there was a crash, when he was with Virgin Trains. There was a crash, and he went up and, interrupted his holiday and went to the site, and and that, you know what he's like. He's a really good communicator.
Yeah, I actually met somebody who'd been head of PR that worked with Richard Branson, who shall remain nameless. But she was telling me that I don't know if I've talked about this on the pod, I will. And they had a big press conference and they were launching something massive. And Richard Branson, she'd never met him. She'd been working for him for about 3 months. And they had this big launch, and it was at the Royal Albert Hall. And they had to come out onto this stage, and he was going to do a 2-minute. The world's media were going to interview him about this big launch. Anyway, they went, and she had to do the. You've got 2 minutes left, and she went, "Sir Richard, you've got 2 minutes," and he went, "Right, okay, see ya," and walked out the room. And she was like, "Oh my god, oh my god!" And then he put his head back round the door and went, "Just kidding," which I thought was brilliant. She said she actually swore. She said she called him a fucker. "You fucker." And he was like, that's the first time she met him.
He probably loved that.
Yeah, he did. That was brilliant. Brilliant. Anyway.
Yeah.
Anne, you've been on the show now. You understand that we do talk about big fuck-ups. We asked you a couple of your mistakes. If you were us, who would you interview next on the next podcast? Who do you think would make a good guest for the show for this?
So I've listened to the show a few times, so I knew you were going to ask this question. And this isn't really about fuck-ups, actually, but this is just something that I think it would be interesting because they do have huge issues. And it's somebody from Charity Comms. I work with lots of charities, and the head of Charity Comms, they advise charities on communications. And if you think about, Oxfam and some of the other issues that charities have had, she's called Adila Worley, but she's the CEO of Charity Comms, and I think she would be a good guest.
Oh, great. Okay, we'll look out for her.
And Anne, do you want to let people know where they can find out more about you if they want to reach out to you or connect?
Yeah, so we are Roughhouse Media, so our email address is roughhousemedia.co.uk, and we do, as well as crisis comm stuff, we do media training and presentation training and various other communications kind of training courses. And we'll write your crisis plan for you, and we'll advise you in a short term, and if you've got a crisis, we'll help with messaging. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's
Thanks for coming on the show, Anne. That was really great.